In 1587, Elizabeth beat her servant so violently that witnesses heard bones crack. This wasn't an isolated incident. Court records reveal dozens of brutal attacks that historians have deliberately hidden for centuries. What if England's Virgin Queen was hiding a medical condition that flooded her body with testosterone and turned her into a violent aggressor who couldn't control her rage? What happens when the most powerful woman in the world regularly beats her servants until they bleed? In March 1587, Lady Mary Howard made the mistake of laughing at the wrong moment during a private conversation with Queen Elizabeth I. The Queen's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Without warning, Elizabeth lunged forward and struck Mary across the face with such force that the sound echoed through the chamber. Witnesses later testified they heard the distinct crack of breaking bone. Mary's cheekbone was shattered, her eye socket fractured, and the left side of her face swelled so grotesquely that she couldn't appear in public for 6 weeks. But here's what makes this incident truly disturbing. It wasn't unusual. Court records that survived the careful censorship of royal historians reveal a pattern of violence so consistent and brutal that foreign ambassadors wrote encrypted letters back to their governments, warning about the English queen's dangerous temper. The Spanish envoy described her as more physically violent than any man at court, noting that male courtiers had learned to keep their distance when they saw the warning signs of an approaching rage. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Elizabeth possessed an unusual physical strength for a woman and seemed to take satisfaction in using it to intimidate those around her. These weren't political executions or calculated displays of royal power. These were personal, physical, uncontrolled attacks that left servants terrified and courtiers walking on eggshells. The violence followed a pattern that modern psychologists would immediately recognize as symptomatic of something deeper than simple anger management issues. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting kept private journals, some of which survived in family archives and weren't discovered until centuries later. These journals paint a picture of systematic abuse that would be shocking in any era, but was particularly unusual for a female monarch. Lady Catherine Carey wrote that the Queen would sometimes grab servants by their hair and drag them across rooms, shouting incomprehensibly. Another lady described an incident where Elizabeth became so enraged during a fitting for a new gown that she ripped the dress off her own body, threw it at the seamstress, and then physically attacked the woman for crying. Sir Robert Cecil's private correspondence mentions having to intervene multiple times when the Queen's violence toward her maids became dangerous enough that he feared she might actually kill someone. But the most revealing detail comes from Dr. John Dee, the Queen's personal astrologer and confidant, who wrote in his encrypted diary that Elizabeth would sometimes experience what he called fits of unnatural choler, where her face would flush red, her voice would drop to a masculine register, and she would become physically aggressive in ways that seemed beyond her control. Dee believed these episodes were caused by an imbalance of humors, the medical theory of his time, but he noted specifically that the Queen's rage manifested in masculine rather than feminine patterns of violence. What makes this violence particularly significant is that it was so carefully hidden from public knowledge while being openly discussed in private diplomatic correspondence. Foreign courts knew about Elizabeth's violent tendencies but couldn't use the information politically without revealing their spy networks at the English court. The few English nobles who witnessed the violence were bound by loyalty and fear to never speak of it publicly. Servants who were beaten signed documents swearing never to discuss their injuries in exchange for medical care and compensation. The entire English establishment conspired to present Elizabeth as the dignified, controlled Virgin Queen. While behind closed doors, she was terrorizing the people closest to her with physical violence that seemed to erupt without warning or provocation. But what if these weren't just royal tantrums born of stress and absolute power? What if there was a medical explanation, a biological reason that could account for both the violence and the desperate need to hide it? The answer might lie in something that 16th century physicians couldn't properly diagnose, but that modern endocrinology would immediately recognize. Here's what nobody tells you about testosterone and aggression. It doesn't just make you more irritable or quick to anger. It fundamentally changes how your brain processes threats, how your body responds to confrontation, and most importantly, what kind of violence you're likely to commit. Women who experience rage typically scratch, slap with an open hand, pull hair, or use objects as weapons. These are feminine aggression patterns rooted in evolutionary psychology and reinforced by socialization. Male aggression looks completely different. Men punch with closed fists, they grapple and use their physical strength advantage, they dominate through size and power, and they often experience a rush of adrenaline during violent encounters that can feel almost pleasurable. Elizabeth's violence followed male patterns exactly. She didn't scratch or slap, she punched. She didn't throw objects at people from a distance, she physically grabbed them and used her strength to hurt them. She didn't need weapons because her own body was the weapon. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed her rages noted specifically that she fought like a man, using techniques and force that shocked them, precisely because they were so masculine. The Venetian diplomat Andrea Badoer wrote a detailed report in 1557 describing Elizabeth's unusually large and powerful hands for a woman, noting that she had the grip strength of a trained swordsman and seemed to take pleasure in demonstrating her physical prowess. The medical evidence gets even more compelling when you look at the full spectrum of testosterone's effects on the human body. High testosterone doesn't just influence behavior, it changes everything. Voice pitch drops as the vocal cords thicken. Hair growth increases in male patterns, particularly facial hair and body hair, while scalp hair begins to thin in male pattern baldness. Muscle mass increases naturally without exercise, particularly in the upper body and shoulders. Height can be affected during developmental years, often leading to above-average stature. Bone structure becomes more pronounced, with larger hands and feet, more defined jaw and brow ridges. Fertility becomes compromised or impossible as the hormonal balance necessary for ovulation is disrupted. And critically for our story, impulse control deteriorates, particularly around anger and aggression, because testosterone interferes with the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate emotional responses. Now here's the devastating part. Elizabeth exhibited every single one of these symptoms. Her physicians documented excessive hair growth that she desperately concealed under elaborate wigs and high collars. She developed male pattern baldness by her 30s that required increasingly elaborate hairpieces to hide. Her voice was described by multiple sources as unnaturally deep and powerful for a woman. She stood taller than most men at court in an era when the average woman was barely 5 feet tall. Her hands were so large and masculine that portrait painters had to deliberately make them smaller in official paintings to avoid scandal. But the most damning evidence comes from what happened when doctors tried to examine her reproductive system. In 1566, Elizabeth fell critically ill with what appeared to be smallpox, though many modern historians question that diagnosis. The illness was so severe that her entire government prepared for her death and the civil war that would follow over succession. Her doctors begged for permission to examine her properly, to understand what was happening inside her body so they could treat her effectively. Elizabeth initially refused, even as her life hung in the balance. Think about that. She was willing to die rather than let physicians examine her body. The political situation became so desperate that William Cecil and Robert Dudley finally convinced her that she had to allow Dr. Hewick, her most trusted physician, to conduct a thorough examination in private. What happened in that examination chamber has haunted historians for over 400 years. When Dr. Hewick emerged after nearly 2 hours alone with the unconscious queen, witnesses reported that his face had gone completely pale, his hands were visibly shaking, and he looked like a man who had seen something that fundamentally shook his understanding of reality. He refused to discuss his findings beyond prescribing immediate treatment. When other physicians pressed him for details about the queen's condition so they could provide proper care, he would physically turn away and leave the room without explanation. Within a year, Dr. Hewick was dead from what records vaguely describe as sudden fever, and his medical notes and personal papers vanished completely. Let's talk about what abnormally high testosterone actually does to the human mind and why it would explain Elizabeth's violent episodes so perfectly. Modern endocrinology has extensively studied women with hyperandrogenism, which is the medical term for abnormally high male hormone levels. The psychological effects are dramatic and consistent across patients. Women with untreated high testosterone report experiencing sudden, overwhelming waves of rage that feel uncontrollable, as if something else is taking over their bodies. They describe the sensation of their vision narrowing, their heart rate spiking, and an almost irresistible urge to physically attack whatever or whoever triggered the anger. The rage builds so quickly that there's no time to deploy normal coping mechanisms or self-control. It feels chemical, biological, like being drugged with aggression. And here's the critical part. After the episode passes, usually within minutes to an hour, the person returns to their normal state and is often horrified by what they did. They remember the rage, but it feels alien, like watching someone else commit violence while trapped inside their own body. Does this sound familiar? Because it matches Elizabeth's behavior exactly. Multiple sources describe her sudden explosions of violence, followed by periods of withdrawal where she would lock herself in her chambers, reportedly in tears, refusing to see anyone. The Spanish ambassador Pedro de Feria wrote something in 1559 that should have raised alarm bells across every court in Europe. In an encrypted dispatch to King Philip II, he stated that he understood from reliable sources at the English court that Elizabeth would never bear children. This wasn't speculation about her political unwillingness to marry. This was intelligence about a biological impossibility, and it came less than a year into her reign, when she was only 25 years old. How did Spanish spies know with such certainty that a young, healthy-looking queen was infertile? What had they discovered or observed that gave them this information? The phrasing of de Feria's letter is crucial. He wrote that for a certain reason which they have recently given him, he believed the information was accurate. That phrase, a certain reason, suggests something specific and observable, not rumors or gossip. Spanish intelligence was the most sophisticated in Europe, with agents embedded throughout foreign courts who were trained to observe and report everything. They had somehow learned something concrete about Elizabeth's physical condition that made childbearing impossible, and they knew it with enough certainty to report it to their king as established fact. The most logical explanation is that someone in Elizabeth's inner circle, possibly a physician or lady-in-waiting, had observed physical characteristics that indicated a hormonal abnormality severe enough to cause infertility. And if that abnormality was high testosterone, it would also explain the masculine aggression patterns that were already becoming apparent to close observers. This brings us to one of the most shocking aspects of this entire story. How many people actually knew the truth and were actively working to conceal it? Elizabeth didn't live in isolation. She was constantly surrounded by servants, ladies-in-waiting, physicians, and courtiers who had intimate access to her daily life. When someone is hiding a significant medical condition, especially one with visible physical symptoms, the number of people who must be complicit in the deception grows exponentially. Consider just the practical logistics of concealing male pattern baldness severe enough to require wigs. That means ladies-in-waiting who dressed her every morning saw her natural hair or lack thereof. The wig makers who created her elaborate hairpieces knew they were covering male pattern hair loss. Physicians who examined her for various illnesses throughout her life would have noted the hormonal symptoms. Servants who prepared her baths and helped her dress saw her body without the concealing layers of clothing. All of these people had to be either loyal enough to keep silent or frightened enough to never speak. The fact that Spanish intelligence acquired information about her infertility so quickly suggests that despite all precautions, information was leaking out through spy networks that had successfully infiltrated the English court. But here's what's truly chilling. The people who knew too much had a disturbing tendency to die young under suspicious circumstances. Picture this. It's 1565 and Elizabeth is in the middle of a tense council meeting, debating whether to support Protestant rebels in Scotland. Her chief advisor, William Cecil, suggests a cautious approach that would avoid direct military confrontation with France. It's reasonable advice, the kind of diplomatic wisdom that has served England well for years. Elizabeth listens quietly, her face unreadable behind the white makeup she's worn constantly since her supposed smallpox illness 3 years earlier. Then something shifts. Witnesses later describe her expression changing suddenly, her jaw clenching, her eyes focusing with an intensity that made experienced courtiers step back instinctively. Without warning, without even standing up from her chair, Elizabeth lunges across the table and punches William Cecil directly in the face with a closed fist. The sound of impact silences the entire room. Cecil stumbles backward, blood pouring from his nose, his eye already beginning to swell. For a moment, nobody moves, nobody breathes. The Queen of England has just assaulted her most trusted advisor with the kind of violence you'd expect from a drunken soldier in a tavern brawl, not from a monarch during a policy discussion. Then Elizabeth stands, smooths her skirts, and walks out of the room without a word, leaving Cecil bleeding and a dozen witnesses trying to comprehend what they just saw. Cecil never filed a complaint, never demanded an apology, never even acknowledged the incident in his official correspondence. He appeared at court the next day with a black eye that took weeks to fade, telling anyone who asked that he'd had an unfortunate accident with a door. But his private letters, discovered in family archives centuries later, reveal his genuine fear. He wrote to a trusted friend that the Queen's temper has grown more dangerous with each passing year, and that he fears one day she will kill someone in her rage and there will be no way to conceal it. He mentions specifically that her violence is not like the anger of other women he has known, but resembles the battle fury he witnessed in soldiers during wartime. This wasn't an isolated observation. Multiple courtiers noted the unusual nature of Elizabeth's aggression, the way it seemed to transform her physically, the masculine quality of her violence. But they also noted something else that's crucial to understanding what was happening. Elizabeth herself seemed terrified of these episodes. After particularly violent outbursts, she would isolate herself for days, refusing even Robert Dudley, the man she loved most. Servants reported hearing her crying behind locked doors, sometimes for hours. This wasn't the behavior of a tyrant who enjoyed inflicting pain. This was someone who felt out of control, horrified by her own actions, trapped in a body that seemed to betray her with rage she couldn't suppress. The French ambassador witnessed something in 1578 that he literally couldn't include in his official reports, because he feared no one would believe him. During negotiations over Elizabeth's potential marriage to the Duke of Anjou, discussions became heated over the question of whether the Duke would be granted real political power or merely be a ceremonial consort. Elizabeth, who had been sitting calmly throughout the discussion, suddenly stood up and physically shoved the ambassador backward with both hands. He stumbled, caught himself on a table, and looked up to see the Queen of England advancing on him, with what he later described as murder in her eyes. Guards had to physically restrain her, actually putting their hands on the monarch's body and pulling her away while she struggled against them. The ambassador was immediately escorted out of the room for his own safety. The incident was never mentioned in any official record. The ambassador's dispatch to Paris described the event, but with careful language suggesting he himself could barely believe what had happened. He noted that Elizabeth's rage seemed to come from nowhere, that there had been no warning, no gradual escalation, just an instant transformation from calm discussion to physical violence. He also noted in a detail that would be easy to overlook that during the struggle her wig had shifted slightly, revealing what he thought might be thinning hair underneath, though he couldn't be certain. These observations, scattered across hundreds of diplomatic reports and private letters, paint a consistent picture of a monarch whose violent episodes were both terrifying and seemingly uncontrollable, whose physical appearance required elaborate concealment, and whose inner circle lived in constant fear of what she might do next. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Why would anyone want to hide this? Why not simply acknowledge that the Queen had a medical condition that sometimes made her aggressive and seek treatment or understanding? The answer reveals everything about power, gender, and legitimacy in the 16th century. Elizabeth's right to rule was already contested on multiple fronts. She was a woman in a world that believed women were naturally inferior and unfit for leadership. She was Protestant in an era when millions of Catholics considered her a heretic and supported her Catholic cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, as the legitimate ruler of England. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who had been executed for adultery and treason, which some argued made Elizabeth illegitimate. Every aspect of her claim to the throne was vulnerable to attack, and her enemies were constantly searching for any weakness they could exploit. Now imagine if it became public knowledge that England's queen possessed masculine physical characteristics, exhibited male patterns of violence, had abnormally high testosterone levels, and was possibly intersex, or had some other hormonal condition that blurred traditional gender categories. In an era that viewed strict gender roles as ordained by God himself, this would have been catastrophic. The political implications would have been immediate and devastating. Every Catholic monarch in Europe would have used Elizabeth's condition to argue that she wasn't truly a woman at all, and therefore had no right to rule as queen. They would have claimed that God was showing his displeasure with Protestant England by allowing a biological aberration to sit on the throne. Religious leaders would have preached that Elizabeth was an abomination, neither truly male nor truly female, proof that England had strayed from God's path by breaking with Rome. The propaganda practically writes itself, and it would have resonated with populations that already viewed the idea of female monarchy with suspicion. Beyond the religious and political attacks, there was the simple fact that Elizabeth's entire carefully constructed public image depended on presenting herself as the ideal of feminine virtue, despite choosing not to marry. She styled herself as married to England, the virgin queen who sacrificed personal happiness for duty to her country. This image only worked if she was perceived as genuinely feminine, genuinely capable of marriage and motherhood, but choosing to forgo them. If people knew she was physically incapable of bearing children due to a hormonal condition, if they knew she possessed masculine characteristics and violent tendencies, the entire narrative would collapse. She would no longer be the noble queen sacrificing for her people, but rather someone hiding a shameful secret that made marriage and motherhood impossible in the first place. The stakes were so high that Elizabeth and her closest advisors took extraordinary measures to maintain the deception. Physicians who examined her too closely died mysteriously. Servants who witnessed her violent episodes were paid off and sent to remote estates. Foreign ambassadors who reported suspicious observations were quickly recalled by their governments after receiving pressure from England. The entire English court operated under an unspoken agreement. You pretend you don't notice anything unusual about the Queen, or you face consequences that range from career destruction to actual death. This wasn't paranoia, it was practical politics. If Elizabeth's enemies obtained proof of her condition, they could have sparked a Catholic rebellion that would have torn England apart. Her own advisors, even those genuinely loyal to her, understood that maintaining the fiction of her perfect femininity was essential to maintaining her power and preventing civil war. The violence against servants became another secret to keep, just one more piece of evidence that had to be concealed. Every time Elizabeth flew into a rage and injured someone, everyone present had to participate in the cover-up or face the terrifying consequences of threatening the stability of the entire English state. The brutalized servants weren't victims who could seek justice. They were potential security risks who had to be managed, paid off, or in some cases, permanently silenced. Let's examine the full catalog of symptoms that Elizabeth exhibited throughout her life. Because when you list them all together, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Start with the physical characteristics that multiple independent observers documented. Her height was exceptional for a woman of her era, standing at least 5 feet 10 inches tall, when the average woman was barely 5 feet. Her hands were large enough that portrait painters had to deliberately scale them down in official paintings because they looked too masculine. Her bone structure was more pronounced than typical for women, with a strong jaw, prominent brow ridges, and broad shoulders that required specially constructed gowns to create a more feminine silhouette. Her feet were large, reportedly requiring custom-made shoes. Her voice was deep and powerful, described by the Venetian ambassador as unusually masculine for a woman and capable of projecting across large rooms without strain. These aren't subjective interpretations or biased observations. These are physical facts documented by multiple sources who had no agenda to create a conspiracy theory. They were simply reporting what they saw and heard, often with confusion because it didn't match their expectations for a female monarch. Now add the symptoms related to hair and skin. Elizabeth began losing scalp hair in her 20s, following male pattern baldness that started at her temples and crown. By her 30s, she required elaborate wigs that became increasingly extreme over time, towering constructions that added nearly a foot to her height and completely concealed whatever remained of her natural hair. Simultaneously, she developed excessive body and facial hair growth that required constant maintenance. Ladies-in-waiting who helped her dress recorded in private journals the extensive hair removal rituals that Elizabeth underwent, using painful techniques involving wax and early forms of depilation cream. The white makeup she wore wasn't just about achieving fashionable pale skin. It also helped obscure dark facial hair that was constantly growing back despite removal. As she aged, the hair growth apparently increased, requiring even more aggressive concealment methods. Her physicians prescribed various treatments, none of which worked effectively because they were treating the symptoms without understanding the underlying hormonal cause. The lead-based makeup she used to conceal everything gradually poisoned her, destroying her skin and creating wounds that then required more makeup to hide, a vicious cycle that continued for decades. But the most medically significant symptom was her complete infertility, despite being examined and declared physically capable of childbearing by multiple physicians. This is crucial. Elizabeth wasn't just unmarried and therefore not having children. She was medically examined on several occasions, and physicians who looked for obvious physical impediments found none. The reproductive organs appeared present and normally formed from external examination. Yet Spanish intelligence knew within months of her coronation that she would never bear children. This suggests that while the external anatomy appeared normal, something about her hormonal system made pregnancy impossible. Modern medicine would immediately recognize this as a classic presentation of conditions like androgen insensitivity syndrome or congenital adrenal hyperplasia, both of which can cause high testosterone levels, infertility, and masculine characteristics while still presenting generally female external anatomy. These conditions were completely unknown in the 16th century. Physicians of that era had no framework for understanding how someone could appear female but have male hormone levels affecting their body and behavior. They might observe the symptoms, the aggression, the masculine voice, the unusual body hair, the infertility, but they had no way to connect them to a single underlying cause. When Dr. Hewick examined Elizabeth in 1566 and emerged looking shaken, he had very likely discovered this hormonal condition, but had no medical language to describe what he'd found. only the terrifying knowledge that the Queen's body wasn't functioning as a woman's body should. The scene in Westminster Palace on March 24, 1603, should have been chaotic with grief and ceremony. Instead, it was choreographed with military precision, as if everyone involved had been rehearsing for exactly this moment. The instant Elizabeth drew her last breath, Robert Cecil, her principal secretary, pulled out a sealed letter containing orders that had been prepared months in advance. Guards immediately took positions at every entrance to the Queen's chambers. No one entered, no one left, without explicit permission from the inner circle that had protected Elizabeth's secrets for 44 years. High-ranking nobles who rushed to pay their respects found themselves turned away by armed men, who refused to explain why they couldn't see their dead queen. Physicians who had attended Elizabeth during her final illness arrived expecting to perform the traditional examination and documentation of a royal death, only to be informed their services weren't required and they should leave immediately. This was unprecedented. Royal deaths required witnesses, documentation, official examination by multiple physicians who would testify that the monarch died of natural causes and not poison or assassination. But Elizabeth's death was being handled like a covert military operation, not a state funeral. What happened in that sealed death chamber over the next few hours can only be partially reconstructed from the scattered testimony of the handful of people who were present. They began undressing the body, removing the layers of clothing that Elizabeth had used to conceal her true form for decades. The jeweled gown came off, then the multiple petticoats, then the heavily structured corset that had created an artificial feminine silhouette. One lady-in-waiting who was present, Lady Scrope, later wrote in a letter that was hidden by her family for generations that removing the clothing revealed a body that had been shaped and damaged by years of concealment. The corset had left deep, permanent grooves across Elizabeth's entire torso, where the boning had pressed into her flesh day after day for 40 years. Some of her ribs were visibly misshapen, broken at some point, and healed improperly under the constant pressure. But according to Lady Scrope's carefully coded language, these injuries weren't the most shocking discovery. She wrote that something about the body's natural form was unexpected, that certain characteristics were present that should not have been, or absent when they should have been present. She doesn't elaborate, can't elaborate without being more explicit than her sense of loyalty and fear will allow. But the implication hangs there in her words. Elizabeth's body contained some biological reality that differed from what people expected to find in a woman's corpse. The speed of what happened next tells you everything you need to know about how desperate they were to prevent further examination. Within 3 hours of Elizabeth's death, her body was wrapped in treated cloth, sealed inside a lead coffin, and that coffin was soldered shut before rigor mortis had fully set in. 3 hours. Compare that to any other royal death in English history. When Henry VIII died, his body lay in state for weeks, examined by numerous physicians, displayed for nobles and clergy, documented extensively. When Mary I died, similar procedures were followed. Royal deaths were public events that required witness and documentation to prevent accusations of foul play and to properly document the end of a reign. But Elizabeth's body was sealed so fast that nobody outside her innermost circle ever saw what was beneath the makeup and wigs and elaborate clothing. The servants who were present during the preparation were immediately given bags of gold coins and orders, sending them to distant estates in Scotland, Ireland, and Northern England. They were accompanied by armed escorts to ensure they actually left London and didn't stop to talk to anyone on the way. Written agreements were produced that each servant had to sign, swearing on pain of death never to discuss anything they had witnessed in the Queen's death chamber. These weren't requests. They were commands backed by the threat of immediate execution for treason if violated. When King James I arrived from Scotland to claim his new throne, one of his first private meetings was with Robert Cecil, who had managed Elizabeth's final days and the sealing of her body. What was discussed in that meeting has never been fully documented, but the outcome is clear. James became the most zealous protector of Elizabeth's sealed tomb. This is the same James whose mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth had kept imprisoned for 19 years before finally ordering her execution. James had every political reason to diminish Elizabeth's reputation, to emphasize the injustices of the previous reign, and position himself as a fresh start for England. Instead, he issued explicit orders that Elizabeth's tomb should never under any circumstances be disturbed, examined, or opened. He moved her remains to share a tomb with her half-sister Mary I, and then had the entire vault sealed with additional security measures. When courtiers suggested that Elizabeth's reign should be thoroughly documented, including medical records and personal papers, James ordered many of those documents destroyed. The official explanation was that he wanted to look forward rather than backward, to unite England after decades of religious tension, rather than dwell on past controversies. But historians have long suspected a different motivation. James had been told what was discovered when they undressed Elizabeth's body, and he understood that revealing it would potentially delegitimize the entire Tudor succession and cast doubt on the monarchy's divine right to rule. For over 400 years, the British establishment has maintained this protective stance with remarkable consistency. Every major royal tomb in Westminster Abbey has been opened at some point for examination, study, or relocation. Richard III was dug up from under a parking lot in 2012 and subjected to comprehensive DNA testing, CT scans, and facial reconstruction that revealed intimate details about his life and death. Henry VII's tomb has been opened multiple times. Edward I was examined. Even ancient Anglo-Saxon kings have been studied, but not Elizabeth. In 1952, when historians petitioned to examine her remains during the coronation of Elizabeth II, the request was denied without explanation. In 1975, when new technology became available that could scan through lead coffins without opening them, providing non-invasive analysis that would leave the remains completely undisturbed, the request was denied again. In 2003, on the 400th anniversary of Elizabeth's death, a coalition of universities and museums proposed a comprehensive study using the most advanced preservation techniques available, promising absolute discretion and offering to keep any sensitive findings sealed for another century if necessary. Denied. The official reason is always the same: respect for the dead, the dignity of the monarchy, the importance of letting the past rest. But that excuse rings completely hollow when you realize they've examined every other significant monarch without such concerns. What's really in that sealed coffin? The most likely answer is exactly what Lady Scrope's letter hints at: a body with clear evidence of a hormonal condition that caused masculinization. If Elizabeth had congenital adrenal hyperplasia or androgen insensitivity syndrome or any other condition that causes high testosterone levels, the physical evidence would be unmistakable to modern pathologists. Bone structure analysis would show masculine characteristics. Any remaining tissue could be tested for chromosomal abnormalities. DNA analysis could reveal intersex conditions or hormonal disorders that 16th century physicians couldn't have understood. And if the Bisley Boy theory has any truth to it whatsoever, if Elizabeth was replaced by a male child in 1544, then the skeleton in that coffin is simply male, and the entire deception would be revealed instantly. The British establishment won't allow that examination because they understand what's at stake. Elizabeth I is England's greatest monarch, the queen who defeated the Spanish Armada, who established England as a world power, who presided over a golden age of culture and exploration that defined an entire era. The truth about her biology doesn't diminish her accomplishments, but it would fundamentally change how those accomplishments are viewed and understood. It would raise uncomfortable questions about gender, identity, and what makes someone qualified to rule. It would provide ammunition for critics of the monarchy who already question its relevance in modern times. Most importantly, it would reveal that the English establishment has been protecting a lie for 4 centuries, and that admission of deception would be almost as damaging as the original secret. So the coffin stays sealed, the truth stays buried, and Elizabeth's secrets remain protected by the same institutional power that protected them during her life. The Virgin Queen's greatest legacy might not be the defeat of Spain or the golden age of culture, but the fact that she took her secret to the grave so effectively that 400 years later, they're still protecting it. If you've made it this far, you've just learned something that historians have been either hiding or too afraid to say out loud for 4 centuries. The evidence is overwhelming. Elizabeth I likely suffered from a hormonal condition that flooded her body with testosterone, caused violent, uncontrollable rages, and explained why she could never marry or bear children. Subscribe to this channel right now because we're digging up the buried truths that traditional history deliberately hides. The medical mysteries, the conspiracies of silence, and the biological realities that shaped world events. Drop your theory in the comments. Do you think Westminster Abbey should finally allow scientists to examine Elizabeth's remains? What would they find if they opened that coffin tomorrow? And smash that like button if you believe the British establishment owes the world the truth after 400 years of protecting the secret. The most powerful woman in history deserves to have her real story told, testosterone and all.